All right, all right, all right. Is this thing on? Can you all hear me? Going once, going twice. I think if we whisper, they can't hear us. Yeah. All righty, folks. If we can slowly settle down, we would love to start regaling you with lots of interesting information. Yeah, I'm going to have to get even more aggressive to get folks to pay attention to me. I don't know, Quincy, why don't you try saying something? Maybe they'll listen to you.
Hey, everybody. We're going to start the panel up here, so pay attention. Nick, why don't you kick us off?
Alrighty, thanks so much for being here. Quincy already stole the thunder in terms of moderation, so that's a good start for me. Love the enthusiasm that's in this room right now. Thanks so much for being here. We are here to talk about everything related to tech, and there are 4 founders and entrepreneurs and extremely intelligent gentlemen sitting next to me that know a lot more about DERVOS than I do, so I'm excited to pick their brains. My name is Nick Van Osdal. I am a venture capitalist. I invest in pre-seed and seed stage stuff across climate and energy, so if that's you, definitely talk to me about it. I also write a newsletter that folks seem to like well enough because that's what landed me on this stage. And I do a lot of freelance writing for climate and energy companies too, so if you need help with writing, you let me know. From there, would love to let the fellow guests introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right in.
Hey, everybody. My name's Quincy Lee. I'm the CEO of Electric Air. Good to be here with you all today.
And I'm Sam Jamaico, founder and CEO at Impulse.
Kieran Batraju, the founder and CEO of Arcadia, and third time at DERVOS, which I'm super pumped about.
We were on a panel last year.
That's
I remember
right.
That.
I'm Henrik, CEO and co-founder of Enode, and first time I'm here, but probably not my last. Really, really excited to be here.
Almost certainly not the last for Henrik, I'm sure. All right, so there are a million different things that we could talk about when we talk about DERVOS, grid tech, the actual technology. As sort of a central theme for the panel today, I'd like to do kind of a reckoning of how did we get to this point where there are a bunch of really enterprising, attractive, intellectual people sitting in a tent interested in this conversation. What tech actually enabled the growth and the interest in this industry? And then I'd also like to discuss where we're actually at sitting here in 2024. What's really happening? How real is DER deployment across various geographies, electricity markets, what have you? And what are the key hurdles that we sort of need to block and tackle to make it even more real going out to 2030 and to actually take a whack out of, you know, natural gas electricity generation, which is still #1 in the United States. So with that setup, maybe we can kind of go across the panel and let's think about, you know, in addition to batteries and solar panels, what other technologies actually enabled us to get to a point where we can integrate and deploy DERs seriously? And I'm thinking, you know, power control systems, smart inverters, like what got us to this point? And batteries and solar panels can certainly be part of it too. Who wants to take a crack at that one?
I'll start, if that's okay. Well, I think it's a good question, and basically, I think to reflect on your first question, which is like, how did we all get here, and how is this all happening? The primary technology that made this all possible, I would just say, is you know, mass manufacturing. Ultimately, mass manufacturing across all of the DERs technologies that we all have come to love and know. Specifically, the price reductions associated with mass manufacturing is really, in my opinion, what is driving the whole movement. So, you know, when you start off building something at quantity 1, you're not going to have a whole lot of cost advantage. But as you scale up your manufacturing capabilities, economies of scales kick in. That's basically what we're seeing across certainly solar and obviously batteries and EVs and now EV charging equipment. So I would say like the kind of underlining principle that's driving the whole industry ahead is exactly that. It's mass manufacturing. And to answer your second question around if it's real, I would just say it's certainly real. It's actually shockingly real. I think like a good shorthand for people in the crowd. I see the commercial solar guy over here from Twitter, so I know he'll appreciate this one. But there was something like 2 terawatt hours of solar deployed globally last year. And to give you context, there's approximately, I think, 160 terawatt hours of primary energy use in the world annually. So there is a mass amount of capacity, generational capacity being deployed. And man, I mean, if you just do the math, we're about 80 years away from taking a huge bite out of today's present energy use. I think energy use is going to grow, so obviously we need to keep deploying. But I mean, that basic thing alone was, it to me is the indicator that this is here, this is happening, and it ultimately comes down to the favorable economics of DERVS, solar, batteries, EVs, charging. It's all better economically, and that's going to be the thing that persists it forward.
Well, I hope we can make it 8 years instead of 80, but we'll do some S curving, and hopefully that comes to fruition. Who else wants to take a crack at this one?
I can go. We can go in line.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think like going off the mass manufacturing side of things, it's like the unlock for like batteries getting, you know, sub $100 a kilowatt hour, and before that, solar having kind of a similar transformation. We're now at the point where the like installation of those things is now the driving factor of, and like why would you bother to install them is like the driving factor versus the actually underlying cost. So I think the big change that's happening kind of starting maybe a couple years ago and into the future is there's going to be kind of this reimagining of everyday products, of like everyday infrastructure, that like how stuff gets to your house, to leverage the fact that we've actually just drove the costs on batteries, power electronics, all this sort of stuff to the level where it can be deployed in everyday devices. So I think I think basically that's a very underrated trend, and it's going to like basically we're going to see a lot more just like interesting use cases and interesting products over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think it's a good call out that, you know, we're not just talking about things at the utility scale. We can talk as specifically as, you know, in your case, Sam, something like a stove in someone's home. Like it's across every possible imaginable infrastructure form factor.
Yeah, and I would also say that the macro problem is like there's this, we talk about generation, we talk about solar deployment, but like the transmission problems are actually a huge issue. And the headwinds are in some sense due to the fact that we've like coated the built world in amber, in a sense. And these the kind of housing theory of everything is actually hilariously true in some cases. But what this means is we need to figure out other ways to solve transmission issues, and it turns out like things like virtual power lines are potentially a better solution, even though you have to buy the batteries, than to like run new wires effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this 3 years in a row, but the biggest unlocks, I think, are ultimately price signals, markets, and the telemetry to react to price signals and markets. And it's kind of amazing that last year, Jigger was here. This year, there was a public service commissioner on stage, that we're finally talking about like the biggest unlocks, or in my opinion, are those three things. And when I think everybody has like their, like a friend, or maybe they're the ones tweeting about Texas. Why is Texas crushing California? And I have my Republican friends that are like, look at Texas. Texas is awesome. And I'm like, yeah, it is awesome because they have price signals, markets, and telemetry to actually install. And one of the things in our business, so we manage the tariff database. And last year it was 20,000 distribution level tariffs, and all the complexity and demand charges and other bullshit they put in there. And then in 1 year we added 10,000 new tariffs. So there's this explosion of distribution tariffs. And as an example, like Detroit Edison just unlocked a off-peak, on-peak tariff that has a 10x delta from 5 cents to 50 cents. You can make money at the meter, and they have the telemetry to actually do this now. Anyway, the broader thing is just markets, price signals, telemetry, and you need regulators to help unlock that.
Yeah, to build on that point about telemetry, I guess an underrated technology is just connectivity, right? The DRs need to be connected wirelessly to the internet. Because if they're not, well, it's going to be really hard to make them do what they have to do to balance out the grid. And that technology is kind of taken for granted in a way now, but it's not that long ago. Most of these devices weren't really connected directly. So I think that's a really important one. And of course batteries, right? Batteries, and especially in the form of EVs. I'm from Norway. In Norway now, 90%, 9 out of 10 cars sold are EVs, and that's like battery EVs. So that's pretty impressive. So I get to see, and we get to see all of our friends and family buy EVs, right? And I'm sure a lot of people here also have been through that. But I think an interesting thing about the EV is that it makes people understand what a kilowatt hour is in a way that people don't know before they buy an EV. So most people don't know what a kilowatt hour is, but when they buy an EV, you actually start to build an intuition about what a kilowatt hour is, because you think about that every time you charge up your car, and you think about the price of that kilowatt hour, and you see how it's different in different locations, and you see how it's different during different times of the day, and you start to really understand what electricity is. And when you start to understand that, you also go down the path, and I've seen so many examples of that. For instance, my mother went from she transitioned from an ICE vehicle to an EV 2 years ago. She's not technical at all. She definitely didn't know what a kilowatt hour is, but after buying that EV, she suddenly went and bought solar for her summer house to charge the EV. So she would never have done that if it wasn't for kind of understanding that. And so I think we see that so many examples of that, where people buy an EV and then they start going down the path of electrification and electrification of their household, which is ultimately what is going to drive this whole energy transition.
Yeah, and I'd love to build on this point a little bit, Henrik, because what I'd like to speak a little bit about now is, everyone in this tent ostensibly is excited about DERVS and knows what they are. But when we talk about, how real this is, and we home in on some specific examples, Norway being a great example, but perhaps also a somewhat regionally specific example and a somewhat rare example of how quickly EV sales there have accelerated. Obviously, it's happened very quickly in other places like China and the United States as well. But I still also imagine that, if I went to a random city in America and I sat down at a bar and I was chatting with a fellow and I asked him, if he knows what a DER is, he probably wouldn't, and he'd probably say, like, I don't know what that is, and I really want to make sure that my child isn't smoking it. So what are some other proof points? And, especially I'm thinking about, for you, Sam, as building a business here in terms of deployment, and you, Quincy, deploying EV charging stations. If we try to put ourselves in the shoes of folks that aren't necessarily sitting inside this tent, like, what would we tell them to convince them that, like, this is really happening right now and you should be really excited about it, you should consider it for yourself, and in 5 years it's going to be just as common as power lines that you already see and don't see because they're so ubiquitous. And when I say don't see, like, don't register is what I mean.
Yeah, I think I would just tell them, I would sell them on the merits of the product alone. I think like that's why this is all happening. It's because fundamentally the products are superior to their legacy associates. Like, EVs are better than gas cars for a variety of reasons. And that's the main thing that I hit on when I talk to people about electric vehicles. Like, my secret agenda is, hey, I really want to decarbonize. What I talk to people about that are not as kind of decarbonization or electrically nerdy as I am is I'm just like, yeah, these cars are freaking awesome. I'm an adrenaline junkie. It's a crazy experience. My car goes 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds, and it costs like, $35,000. Like, that's mind-blowing. Oh, by the way, and it just drives itself because it's a large digital platform. Oh, and by the way, it costs like nothing to maintain, and it's free to basically fill up. It's way better, and that's what we should just all be telling people about literally all of the technologies we're talking about. I mean, solar is another great example of that. There's literally no input cost to generating energy from solar. You just pay one-time CapEx, a little bit of maintenance, and boom, you're off to the races, and you're literally just pulling energy out of the air. Technically out of photons. But but like I think just if we all led with the, hey, this is better, this is better, this is better. Here's practical things that you should care about, and then get them in an EV, get them associated, get them looking at an energy bill for solar, or whatever else it is, get them looking at a next gen stove. People are blown away by that, and then it's obvious because nobody wants to feel like a Luddite, right? As soon as we all saw the iPhone and we're like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. What did we do? We threw our flip phones and rotary phones away, right? Overnight. So product wins. We have to keep building exceptional products, and if we do, it just will all go faster. The S-curve will kick in faster.
Yeah, really quickly on the multidimensionality, I like that, and I think it's an extremely important piece of the communication, also for health benefits beyond warming. If we talk about replacing a gas stove with an induction stove, for instance, there can be considerable, personal health level benefits of that, and also just mitigating air pollution, whether it's, all the other emissions that come out of a tailpipe beyond carbon dioxide, huge benefits to that as well. And Sam, I'd love to pass it to you next to jump in on that.
It's actually interesting too. Is like how do you convince someone with a gas stove that they want to switch? And I think the right answer is not to go yell at them and tell them to eat some vitamins. It's like you need to hand out some candy. And so I think that we've been very, very, very intentional on trying to basically lead with the fact that this unlocks capabilities you wouldn't otherwise have. Even if you have an electric stove and don't like it, you still can buy our product and it would be better than the electric stove in your house already. And this also was a reaction to another thing we noticed, which is, why does every house not already have a battery? And I think the big thing is there's a certain contingent of people who get solar panels, or they get an EV and they get into this funnel. A lot of people live in multifamily, doesn't make sense. And then if you don't have solar, you're probably not going to have a battery. And then the only reason that you really have the battery is there's two really. There's I'm going to economize my solar panels under a net metering regime that doesn't let me export, or I'm going to, my house works in a power outage. And there's no additional bonus beyond that. It's invisible otherwise. And what we realized was effectively is that what if there's a new thing you can do? What if you can have just a fundamentally more awesome device? And we lead with that. It happens to include a battery. That battery happens to be installed in your house in a way that it actually can interact with the grid. That's a pretty compelling story, and I don't actually have to go and explain to a consumer, hey, literally the entire backstory of what a DER is, why they should have a battery in their house, why having a battery in their house is personally awesome, all this other stuff. It's the stove just boils water way faster and has exact temperature setting, and it's great. And you'll when you're remodeling your house, you'll go buy this thing and it'll be great. That's the pitch that wins, and I think it's the same story with EVs, where it's okay, cool, you get 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds in a $35,000 vehicle, and you do not get that in another car at all.
Yeah, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like a through line that I've heard from both you, Sam, and Quincy, and that I think extends to not just this industry, but many others, is there's sort of an element of the Trojan horse, right? You build a delightful product, and then unlike the Trojan horse example, a lot of other great things come with it, as opposed to invaders that are going to tear down your house. But yeah,
you might save money on your energy bill. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to murder you in your sleep. Anyways, onwards. Before I get kicked off the stage by Duncan.
I'll just add one thing. I think everything said is very true for residential customers. And a lot of that bleeds into commercial, but when I think about our commercial customers, their hierarchy is still the cheapest kilowatt hour. I would say 2 years ago, it was cheapest kilowatt hour, and then far second, cleanest kilowatt hour. And now with a lot of big corporates, it's cleanest kilowatt hour. Where is my next kilowatt hour, the nth kilowatt hour coming from? How do I get it? And then clean kilowatt hour. So I just think it's a little product still has to be fantastic, still has to be amazing, but that's the hierarchy of needs, at least for the Fortune 1,000, 500, is cheapest, how do I get the next kilowatt hour, and clean. And I think that's an important thing.
Right.
When we think about our sales process, that's how we think about the data we're providing to them.
Yeah. So trying to explain why someone would get excited about DRs, I think there you can kind of break it into things. There's one is the electrification part of it, right? Like you're buying new awesome products that are better than the ones you used to have, and they're electric, and you're electrifying. We have to electrify, right? And then the second part, which is also interesting, is the flexibility part, and that's what we are mainly focused on, right? So, I mean, we all know we have to electrify and we have to have lots of renewable, and it's going to cause lots of strain on the grid, and we need flexibility to balance out supply and demand, right? And the DRs are going to make out half of that flexibility, right? So the DRs are going to make it possible to end up with a renewable energy system. And I think people get really excited about that. But it's also important because consumers have to actually actively engage with that at some point, right? You have to actively engage and actively participate into a managed charging program. You have to actively manage, or the consumers have to actively participate in that. So they have to be convinced about that at some point, I think. Ideally, just through something that's cheaper and better, right? But like, I think if they also understand it, I think it's, you know, consumers will be more engaged.
Excellent, yeah. I'd love to also, you know, I didn't necessarily position this in the central framing at the outset, but I think it'd be really interesting to talk about actual business building, because everyone on the stage is involved in building real businesses at different stages of it. We have, you know, myself with a tiny bit of the investment perspective. Kieran, I know you also do a lot of good angel investing. And everyone in this room, to a certain extent, is also ultimately concerned with how do we build real businesses around that. So at the highest level, maybe we can just talk about, you know, the experience sitting here at the end of 2024, what it's like to be building a business, what the key challenges are, and then we can kind of talk about how we block and tackle some of those to scale all of this up significantly, so that when we have this conversation again next year, we're having a different conversation about how far along we actually are.
Yeah, so 2024, you know, what's the view, what's the perspective? I think, you know, obviously we're in a high cost of capital environment. Inflation rates spiked, and the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates and to temper inflation and all that. That pushed a lot of more due diligence and basically a slowdown of capital deployment into startups, a pretty significant one. And I'm sure a lot of people have read those stories and are familiar with that. That basically was a forcing function for startups to get better, like really quick, which honestly I think is a good thing. I think that society benefits from having a hurdle rate, and it also, I think, made this vintage of founders much more astute on how to start good businesses and what things they need to focus on to be successful, to actually attract capital, to continue to grow their business. So I think, you know, obviously as interest rates temper off, my hope is that founders will kind of maintain that good hygiene. And that brings me to the second point, which is, what is good hygiene? How do you actually build a business? I mean, honestly, I think the most important thing is the thing that I just said, which is you really, really have to have an exceptional product. Like, that's the root of the value in the company, and it makes everything downstream from that just way easier. So having a really good product and, you know, working at that until it's good and not spending capital until it's fantastic is the first step. Like, make excellent products, and then you obviously have to get really good at selling and marketing. And then you actually have to get really good at generating free cash flow. And then if you're lucky to make it that far, then you kind of get into kind of financial engineering and the business and like creating like derivative offshoot products. Like, that's the arc of a company. I think we're kind of in that third to second phase where we're really scaling up on sales and marketing and are really focusing on like getting like operationally profitable. And that's good. That's exactly what founders should do in tech, like as quickly as you can, because it's non-dilutive and it's a faster way to bootstrap your business. So if your objective function is to, you know, grow quickly, get profitable, create a lot of money, and invest it back in the corporation. So yeah, I think you know, if we all do that as an industry really well, that just accelerates the deployment loop even faster. And we can get better, awesome, clean DERVS type products out quicker.
Yes, the hurdle rate conversation is probably one that we could talk about for an hour, but I just wanted to quickly double click on, you know, it is ostensibly true that when you have a higher cost of capital, it can slow deployment, it can make it more expensive. But at the same time, in the past, when interest rates were zero, it didn't necessarily always mean that money flowed to its highest and best uses. So there's an interesting tension there sometimes of that actually being beneficial.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment of like, there's actually, it's being kind of described as like a renaissance in hardware startups right now because the money is going to things that are actually creating real value. And ironically, if there were 0% interest rates, you know what the most investable thing would be is like 8-picture JPEGs or something like that. Because and so all the like no one's investing in NFTs now; they're investing in DERs basically at this point. So I think that in some sense there's an interesting situation just on the capital market side because of that. The other thing is like, and I'm sure you can touch on this too, but basically like if you build a hardware business, the manufacturing and supply chain is like the ball game. It's like, can you actually deliver quality units at scale and have those pass compliance and regulatory? That is a whole can of worms that is almost like too long for an entire session just devoted to it. But it turns out it's like not just build something that people want, but build something that is legal to install in their house is a big deal and needs to be taken very seriously.
I'll say, well, speaking of angel investing, the seed checks, the seed rounds are still way too high priced. So I kind of slowed it down. There's a lot of you have doing some really amazing things, but it still feels a little frothy. Just two things I think just broadly on business building. I'm 15 years into building two different companies. It's extremely, the highs are extremely high and the lows are very low, and it's hard. But the two things that I think are just important because there's a lot of founders here, is I think speed is still the only like real competitive advantage that any of us have on the incumbents. And I think you have to constantly remind yourself that speed is like the only thing that matters to go up against massive incumbents. And the second thing that I experienced myself, because now I'm like 9 years into Arcadia, I did like this calendar audit 2 years ago, and I realized I was spending like so much less time talking to customers, and it feels like that is also the only thing that matters, is just spending as much time making up excuses and reasons to talk to your customers about how they're using your product, what's working, what's not working, what issues they're facing. And so I just think like we're all building energy businesses, most of us, and but those two things I think are just like universal: speed and just like really asking like, are you spending enough time with customers to understand your product, your marketing, your business.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Quincy's point about kind of the frothy market of 21, 22. That was an anomaly, right? Like we can't have it like that. That was crazy times, right? So being down to a more normal level where you actually have to have a sound business is just good, right? It makes you prioritize and make you do the right choices, and that's kind of the essence of building a company, right? You have to have a healthy economics, but. Maybe more specific to what we do and challenges we face. We're a B2B company. We're in DER API, and we sell that to other businesses who build products on top of that. And they have to have a positive ROI on that, right? So they have to actually make good use of that and build something that makes sense for them. So I think that's a challenge for us to really help our customers do that in a very, very complicated domain, because getting from connecting a DR to getting value out of that in the wholesale market or in any kind of like price signal that you are using is an incredibly challenging thing. And we're operating in a very challenging system, which is just really hard, and then trying to really figure out how to do that. But the cool thing is that it's the most exciting thing to be working on, right? Like it's so incredibly rewarding and such a privilege to be working on solving maybe the most important challenge of our lifetime. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, that would be a great note to end on, but I'm glad we don't have to end on it because I'm sure we have some more time. Which, Duncan, I would love a little bit of a time check of an estimation of how much more real estate I've got here. Okay, wonderful. That's more than I thought. Moderating one of these always feels like equally as much of a race as like trying to actually deliver decarbonization results between now and 2030.
You've entered a vortex.
Yeah, I mean, we'll maybe, you know, overstay our welcome, but we'll see what happens. Building on everything we just talked about, I would. Yeah, okay, good point. I guess I'll ask one more question, and then Q&A would be a very smart thing to do. Thank you for that reminder. Let's just talk about the challenges component a little bit. I think, you know, Henrik, you introduced one earlier, which is like both challenge and opportunity around sort of the interconnectedness of all these devices. It's a very different grid paradigm that we're talking about transitioning to versus historical norms, where there's a lot more pressure for all of the devices as well as all of the stakeholders involved in their installation and management to think about things like interoperability, the interconnectedness of the devices, and that introduces new risks that, you know, utilities often are already moderately well versed in navigating, but other players might not be. Specifically, I'm thinking about cybersecurity, for instance. Theoretically, every single new device integrated in some capacity is more attack surface area for cyber threats, and if they all use, I see some disagreement perhaps, but we can talk about that. And if they all use
I don't think your impulse induction stove is a threat to the grid.
I mean, unless
I think the utility will say it's a threat to the grid.
Unless you sell 1 million of them in one jurisdiction, and then like,
Right.
and then there's some interesting things you can do with the inverter in each one. But you get the idea.
Yeah, and then I mean, if a lot of these devices use, you know, similar software systems, that's where some risk comes in. So, you know, maybe we don't want to talk about cybersecurity, and that's fine. But whatever
I think
the
it's a
risk
red herring. I think utilities love talking about cybersecurity, and all this stuff is made up.
Great. Then let's tell you. Then
We know how to solve that, right? Like we know how to solve, like we can solve it, right? It's not a new thing, right? There's a lot of things like we know the solutions to how to build secure software and devices. So we just have to make sure it's the #1 priority for all of us, and also realize that it's a thing for the ecosystem. So if one actor messes up, it will hurt all of us.
Right.
So everyone, we have to make sure that everyone has that as an absolute #1 priority, and keep everyone accountable to that.
Yeah, I mean, people are still shooting at distribution stations. Like, that's a real threat.
right.
Smart meter conspiracy theories as well.
Yeah,
Those still
exactly.
exist, yeah.
Right. The induction stove or the EV charger is not the
Right.
threat right now.
Let's,
I do think though that like one thing is, again, people follow cybersecurity best practices, and there's gonna be basically the actual bigger problem that I think is interesting is everyone's gonna need to play nice, because there's gonna be like, you're gonna have a mix of various brands connected stuff in your house now, and using a variety of different, you know, back-end APIs. Like, this is gonna turn into I'm just seeing the looming reality of us needing to define a bunch of new standards.
Yeah.
And do not view the incumbents as credible in being able to do that well.
Yeah. I mean,
That should be Allison. You should put that on the list.
Yeah.
Create the standards.
Yeah, and it's like if you think about, you know, just like a UL solutions type business, how do they keep pace with all of the innovation that companies are driving? But in any case, I am sensing that, you know, what I threw out was not the biggest challenge. So let's reorient, and you tell me what the biggest challenge on your minds are.
So I actually do, I think you touched on this too. It's like basically we've now got all these new technologies that are now cheap enough to put in new types of devices. You need to still abide by what AHJs require in terms of safety standards and various other things like that, to get these into people's houses legally. And so that's just a big thing, is like getting, you know, standards bodies, National Electric Code, you know, various other like institutions to actually move fast enough, given pressures from probably like 24 companies on next generation products, basically. So I think that's a big thing. And then, I think that's just straight up a big thing.
I'd say that interoperability between those devices is one of the main challenges. I mean, obviously I'm biased because that's kind of what we work on, but it's essential. Like if we don't have interoperability, and if we don't succeed at that, we will lose out, right? Like we will. It will take much longer to bring renewable energy into the system. So and it's a real risk that we actually kind of make that happen. But I think everyone needs to realize how important interoperability is, and that includes all the OEMs and everyone in the ecosystem have to buy into that, because I don't think there's any other way that we can create the playing field of innovation and actually making this work in this complex system if there is no interoperability.
Yeah, and like my view is like, if you think just appliance-wise, it's like people get a whole mix of different devices in their house, and maybe you've got like a Tesla Powerwall on top of whatever you pick for a stove, whatever you pick for a refrigerator, etc. There's an interesting game too, where some of these interoperability standards are going to have to start overlapping with the compliance and regulatory stuff as well, because like, hey, like your smart inverter needs to be able to talk to other sensors in your house, or your solar panel microinverters or whatever. Those problems are currently, I would describe as not very well addressed, and I'm suspecting that there's going to be problems in the next 5 years related to those.
I don't think it's necessarily very hard to solve from a regulatory perspective, though. It's just putting the consumer at the center. So putting the consumer who owns the device, they own the data, they own the controls of that device, and they should be able to do whatever they want with that device. I think if you just create that kind of playing field, you kind of solved it. But if you want to like try to get into the details and do all the different kind of specifications of every little standard of how everything is going to communicate, like then it's just going to be a mess, right? It's never going to work out.
I think on a related note, I guess to interpret your question, when you say the biggest challenge, like I think it's important to define the objective first. For me, the objective is to get as many DERs and basically next-gen energy assets on the grid as quickly as we can. And then the second part of that objective is to functionally use them in a manner where we can basically operate the grid effectively, using it as flexible load, and then shuttling electrons where they need to go to, from an end consumer perspective, most intelligently. So I think like if that's the objective, which in my opinion, that's the objective that we should all be thinking about, and there's a lot of like derivative topics therein, but like that to me is the primary utility function. If that is the thesis, the things that in my mind inhibit that are a couple-fold, and I think probably the most salient one is just deploying quickly. Like we're moving way too slow as like an industry. Like, man, it's so hard to get things interconnected, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced that. We need to like supercharge our permitting and interconnection process. And I know FERC 2323 just came out. That's transmission level, not distribution level, is my read of it. And it's just in the early days. Like, if anybody has any leeway or agency over that specific problem, if you're like a regulator or a utility, like, man, pedal to the metal, because we got to get these things out there, and streamlining the process and being present and efficiently moving it through the DERs through their interconnection process and actually building things quickly. That's the number one problem, in my opinion, that impacts like all of our adjacent industries. Interconnection is super hard. And then the second thing is we often talk about like flexible load. That's like a curtailment side equation, right? There's the other part, which is input or output. So pushing electrons back into the grid and having those electrons end up at the right location. That second thing is like really, really hard to do. It turns out like in New York, I think they call it a CERC study. And it's like a long $50,000 thing, and man, it just takes forever. And you basically get to this point where, as a company who has an EV battery at every one of our EV charging stations, you're like, man, it's too much work, and economically, it kind of ruins the ROI. So, getting electrons back out, I think, is the really final big problem. I think the way that we could all do better on both of those two aforementioned problems is having a virtual instance of the grid. Like, that's where this all has to go. We have to get like way smarter about everything that's been deployed, what capacity every single transformer has, what it's specifically pulling at any given moment in time. Like, if we all think about what the future grid looks like in 200 years, it's going to be that. And not until we get there are we going to really be able to effectuate the badass grid that we all want to see, that has tons of DERs on it, because the present circumstances are not effective to, or are not, they don't lend itself to achieving that. So that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, and I think the fact that basically I think the fact that basically there's no data overlay on top of the power distribution on the grid is like, I mean, obviously when it was created, obviously we didn't have these capabilities, but essentially that feels like the end game, and what's going to be very interesting is like, hey, the line actually tells you what its capacity and utilization are, kind of like how an Ethernet cable does or something like that. And so that transformation, I think, is going to be gradual. The other thing I think is just really interesting is like the regulatory side. We need to start looking to other countries. Hilariously, like the irony is Europe is amazingly ahead on like DERs in the home actually than the United States, because you can just plug in one of these like anchor batteries and like suddenly your home has a 3 or 4 kilowatt hour battery in your house and it just works. But that is very, very illegal in the United States. And so a number of things like that, which is actually the name for it is Balcony Solar Initiative, which started in Germany. I think we need to start thinking about stuff like that. And then also on the interconnection side, it's like, okay, we should make sure that it's as chill as plugging something in, even if we're not there yet on the electrical standards or anything like that.
Yeah, love it. All right, it's time for the audience to ask some better questions than I have so far.
We're gonna do one or two.
Okay, well, who's got
Anyone
one?
want to ask questions? Oh, you, right.
Hey, everybody. What percentage of your people that install all this cool gear, their car, their stove, their everything, what percentage of those people are going to allow them to participate in the grid? Most people currently are saying, no way, I'm going to let you kill my car battery because that's my big investment. But if I got a 1 million mile car battery, I don't care. So what are your customers? What do you feel?
So there's the car battery thing. I think is a really good point. I think the V2G UX has a big problem because it meaningfully limits your vehicle. Like it takes away miles from your car's range. The battery longevity concern is getting addressed because of LFP. Like these are like 4,000 cycle cells versus like 800 cycle cells. So like the battery aging to allow the the battery aging that would happen on this sort of thing is probably worth the discount on the charging or whatever you're going to get. For us, it's actually very interesting because like we don't need the stove battery to be charged at all really to let you cook. It's essentially there for power augmentation when the device is plugged in. And like you can actually see when you're actively cooking with multiple elements active, like it's often using less than a 120 volt plug, like just while you're actively cooking up like crazy. Now, when you start ramping power, it'll pull 7, 8, 9, 10 kilowatts, depending on how much power is needed for that specific element. But it's something where the amount of battery capacity you need remaining to like have a decent user experience without any sort of like degradation in performance is like, it's like 10%. But the battery needs to be attached to actually give you that capability because it essentially works as a power buffer. So our thinking is, given that's the kind of UX for our product, it's kind of like a car that has infinity miles range because it's got an overhead line or something on top of it. It's kind of a way to think about it. It's more like a trolley bus than a untethered vehicle. We can opt the customer in with direct savings that we can just communicate to them. Be like, hey, you're going to save money on your energy bill if you opt into this program. Now, we obviously control your battery at that point, but like, I think that argument's going to be a lot easier because the presumed sacrifice isn't really there in the same way as an EV.
Well, thanks so much for the question. I'm sure everyone would love to answer it, but maybe we'll make room for...
One more. You grab me.
Hey, you guys, at least two people mentioned that interconnection on the distribution grid is one of the biggest things holding back DERs. Do you have any thoughts, recommendations on how we actually improve that situation?
Yeah, I think, so that the FERC 2023 was a good ruling, I think. It basically time-bounded the process at the transmission level. I think we need to replicate that at the distribution level. And then for consumer-grade products, like Sam just mentioned, that should be, and I'm not super familiar with actually what the interconnection process is going to be for the stove, but like if it's painful, which I suspect it might be, we need to solve that. We need to be like, oh, let's make it awesome and just really fast so everybody can buy it and everybody can save energy, and make sure that the communication protocol is like really well established, and then also time bound it so it's smooth and easy. So just taking it one level down, distribution, like a FERC order for the distribution level grid, and the transmission interconnection process there, and like that should be just dialed and super fast and time bound, and then people will just figure it out.
Thanks so much for the question as well. Is that about all for us, James, or one more? All right, who's got one more for us? I've got one in the back over here. I'll just run the mic to you.
Too late.
Hey guys, I was curious if we think we have good enough signals from the utilities or from the ISOs to really optimize what DERs can do. I guess my example is I'm with Excel Energy. I want to charge my EV at the lowest carbon time frame, and I don't have any signal to get that information. And so I think my DERs are sort of totally unable to accomplish what I'm trying to do without that signal. Curious if you had any other thoughts.
No. It's just, we're not there yet. I mean, we're making a lot of progress though. Actually, Excel has a number of time of use rates for commercial customers. And we're adding more and more of those. But again, it comes down to price signals, but you need telemetry. You have to settle, James will love hearing this. You got to settle to the meter and be able to do that. We spent billions on smart meters. We have to do that. I think both this issue, maybe the interconnection issue, I'm often one to attribute a lot of cynicism toward the utility. But I think in this case, and you might agree, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, there's actually not enough engineering capacity at the utility. And you actually need the regulator to compel the utility to hire the staff to do the fast permitting and fast interconnection, fast engineering, create the time of use rates, and do the work. So in some respect, it's going to the regulator as a utility and saying, I need more. Because like in DC where I live, I think Pepco has like 2 engineers who work on, DER permitting. I mean, it's just not enough.
This happened in physical infrastructure as well, because like California high-speed rail, one of the reasons why it is so expensive is basically they subbed out to essentially third-party consultants because they don't have the engineers on staff vertically integrated in the government agencies anymore that are actually managing these projects. This same issue exists literally fractal across all of society, and it's very interesting because of like there's almost like centers of expertise where people know how to build like UL compliant widgets, and then those all get rolled up into bigger solutions providers. Like on the device level and stuff like that. And we're now at the point where we've got a bunch of new tools in the toolbox, but like the top level engineering leadership isn't there to like allow us to access them.
But in Texas, the answer would maybe be maybe or yes, no? Or
Though the AHJs in Texas are actually also a big headache for my friend who does a battery company there.
Yeah,
so.
Because I mean, like most of our customers are in deregulated markets in Europe or in Texas, and like there you have the price signals, right? You can act on them or the energy retailer, or you can get those price signals from the market. So I mean, that's at least easier when you're dealing with vertically integrated utilities. It's a whole different problem. Yeah.
All right, well, with that, I would like to thank each and every one of you for your attention and your presence and the work that you also do. And of course, a huge round of applause for our panelists. And if you have more questions, come find us. We're going to be hanging out. Thank you so much.